I first watched The Lord of the Rings when I was about 6 to 8 years old. And there is something you have to understand. In the early 2000s, fantasy meant one thing: Harry Potter. Harry Potter was the event, the whole religion. So when I'm watching The Fellowship of the Ring, my tiny child brain is fully convinced that I'm basically watching The Philosopher's Stone. Because look, they even have trolls. And then the bridge scene happens. Out of the dark comes this massive presence, a Balrog. I just remember at that moment my eyes widening and I was leaning forward without realizing it. There's Gandalf standing his ground against this foe that looks larger than life. The epic clash between them with the whips and Gandalf saying, "You shall not pass," and it all finally coming to an end with Gandalf's fall. And something did click in that moment for me because I remember genuinely confused. Is this really Harry Potter? Because in my head, fantasy meant candles, castles, and kids with funny hats, not grown men on an epic quest to save the world. What I didn't realize back then is that I was watching a standard being set. And 25 years later, it feels like we stopped chasing it. Before we talk about the movies, I want to talk about the man himself. J.R.R. Tolkien. See, Tolkien fought in the First World War, and my feeling is that he probably wrote The Lord of the Rings partially to escape that reality, but also to process it. Middle-earth was built as a world first, and Tolkien approached it less like a novelist and more like a historian, writing legends, songs, family trees, and languages. I mean, seriously, look at this clip I'm about to show you.
Oh, God. I made a mistake, didn't I?
The man notices a mistake in a language he invented and tries to correct himself. He built full languages with grammar, with structure, and only after did the cultures and stories grow around them. That order matters, because it means that the world feels internally consistent rather than assembled for convenience. This is also why the books have this pace. They take their time. Tolkien spent decades returning to this world, revising it, reshaping it, abandoning parts of it, then coming back again. That time is embedded in the writing. Another important part of Tolkien's philosophy is how he handled meaning, as he strongly disliked obvious allegory. He didn't want to tell people what to think or what something stood for. Meaning was supposed to emerge naturally. Characters aren't one note. They fail, they carry guilt. And this is where the real problem with the adaptation begins. Middle-earth itself resists shortcuts. It resists simplification. If you strip away the weight, the patience, all that's left are surface elements with elves, orcs, dwarfs, swords, and magic. And none of that explains why the story matters. The foundation meant that any attempt to adapt The Lord of the Rings carried an unusual kind of risk to it. And for a long time, people genuinely believed that it couldn't be done. After Tolkien, the first real attempt to bring this world to the screen came in 1978, the aptly named The Lord of the Rings. This version usually gets brushed aside in conversation, often reduced to a footnote, which feels a bit unfair because it comes from a place of genuine ambition. The people behind it clearly cared about the material. They understood the story and the weight behind it, and they tried to find a way to translate it using the tools that they had at the time. Animation really felt like the only doorway available. Live action on that scale felt unreachable because budgets couldn't stretch far enough and technology hadn't caught up, while animation offered freedom. You could show armies and monsters all without them being physically there. And in some ways it works. There are moments in that film that feel eerie. The rotoscoping gives it a strange texture as it leans into the discomfort. But the problems show up quickly. The story moves too fast. Characters pass through events instead of living inside them. Emotional beats arrive and disappear before they can even settle. The world feels compressed, like someone trying to tell a long journey while skipping the parts where the walking actually happens. And that's kind of the key issue. The Lord of the Rings depends on time. When time gets reduced, the story still exists, but the weight starts to thin out. The 1978 film shows something important though. It proves that people were already trying to take this story seriously. They weren't treating it like a cartoonish adventure or a fairy tale meant for children. They understood that this world needed atmosphere and gravity. What it also shows is the limit of compromise. You can change the medium and experiment with style. You can make bold technical choices, but if the story doesn't have room to breathe, something essential slips away. That's why this version ended up unfinished. Not because the creators lacked passion, but because the story was never given the time it needed. And that idea followed The Lord of the Rings for years after. People didn't doubt that the story mattered. They doubted that cinema, at that moment in time, could give it the patience it needed. Which makes what comes next even more unlikely. And then Peter Jackson enters the picture. On paper, he feels like the wrong choice. He wasn't known for prestigious films. His background came from low-budget horror movies. But that background mattered, because Jackson understood how things needed to feel in front of the camera, how physical reality turns into belief to the audience. If something existed in front of the lens, it carried weight, even if viewers couldn't explain why. He approached Lord of the Rings carefully, almost protectively, like something that could easily fall apart if rushed or mishandled. What often gets overlooked is how close this project came to being compromised before it even started. Studios didn't rush to make it because fantasy carried a real financial risk, and attaching a massive budget to elves and orcs made executives nervous. At one point, the entire story was meant to be compressed into fewer films, simply because giving it more time felt dangerous. But Peter Jackson pushed back because he understood what earlier attempts had already shown. This story doesn't survive compression. You can shorten the scenes, but once the space between the moments disappears, the meaning starts to collapse. The journey carries as much importance as the destination itself. Eventually, something rare happened. All three films were approved together, and pre-production stretched across years. Character arcs were planned across the entire journey instead of being reset with each film. That single decision changed everything, because it allowed the trilogy to exist as one continuous experience rather than a series of disconnected events. It was a huge risk. Fantasy still felt uncertain at the time. Most of the cast was unknown, and careers were tied to one vision with no safety net. If the first film failed, everything fails with it. What makes this moment stand out is how that trust was used. As Jackson didn't spend it chasing spectacle, he used it to protect the tone of the story and the space it needed to breathe. He allowed scenes to unfold slowly, and the silence carried meaning. The world revealed itself without being forced. And this is where the shift happens. Earlier adaptations tried to force the Lord of the Rings into cinema, while Jackson reshaped cinema around Lord of the Rings. Once the time was secured, the next risk became the people who had to live inside the story. Most of the cast weren't established stars, and that choice mattered more than it might seem at first. The goal was never for you to recognize these people. It was for you to forget who they were outside the film. These actors signed on knowing it would take years, with no guarantee it would work. And that commitment started long before the filming ever began. They trained together, lived together, so by the time the cameras finally rolled, these characters already felt like they belonged next to each other. You can feel that grounding most clearly in Viggo Mortensen. Aragorn never feels like someone discovering heroism on the fly. He feels worn down from the start, like a man who has already lived through things that the story doesn't need to spell out for you. Mortensen leaned into the physical side of the role in a way that shows on screen. Not through sheer spectacle, but more through restraint. The performance carries weight because it never asks for your attention. The same can be said for Ian McKellen's Gandalf. The role could have easily drifted into theatrical axis, but instead, it's built on control. The authority comes from stillness, from timing, from knowing when to speak and when to hold back. When Gandalf enters the scene, the energy shifts, and that doesn't come from volume or spectacle, it comes from sheer presence. Then there's Elijah Wood. He carries the emotional center of the story as Frodo, and he plays him with a quiet vulnerability that slowly shifts into exhaustion and burden. You can see the weight building behind his eyes as the journey progresses. That transition feels gradual, and because of that, it feels honest. And one more special mention that deserves its own spotlight is Andy Serkis. His performance as Gollum pushed motion capture into new territory. Instead of treating it like a technical effect, he treated it like a full character work, bringing physical nuance and emotional complexity into something that could have easily felt artificial. I can't go over what every actor did here because the video would just take too long, but they all deserve praise. The chemistry across the entire cast feels earned rather than manufactured, and that only happens when everyone commits to the same vision. This casting philosophy becomes even more clear when you look at modern examples that take the opposite approach. Take Chris Pratt as Mario. When you watch him perform, you don't really see an Italian plumber. You see Chris Pratt, the celebrity. Now, this criticism isn't more about the quality, it's just more about immersion, as you never fully replace the character with the actor in your head. That's the key difference here. In The Lord of the Rings, the actors fade into the world. Their identities dissolve and the characters take over. That didn't happen by accident. It came from casting for fit rather than safety, and from years of commitment. The long shoots, the physical strain, and the shared time all leave traces on screen. Fatigue reads as real because it was real. Relationships feel earned because they were built over years, not just weeks. And the story benefits because the people telling it carried its weight together. In a story built around endurance, that kind of commitment matters. Because without it, None of this holds. Now that the actors were in place, the world itself had to carry the same level of seriousness, because performances only hold when the environment around them feels equally grounded. The original trilogy treated Middle-earth as something that needed to exist before it was filmed, which meant building real sets, shooting in real locations, and constructing miniatures that the camera could interact with physically. That approach created consistency across the entire production, so nothing felt like it belonged to a different film or operate under different rules. When every department works from the same philosophy, the audience stop questioning what they're seeing and start accepting it as reality. This is where the difference becomes clear when you compare it to The Hobbit. The Hobbit relied much more heavily on digital environments, and that shift changes the relationship between actor and world. In the original trilogy, digital effects extended the foundation that had already existed physically. In The Hobbit, digital tools often became the foundation itself. In The Hobbit, the scale increases, but the relationships between characters and the world changes in a subtle way, because the environment feels more engineered and the performances adjust around that structure instead of being shaped by it. This may seem technical at first glance, yet it alters immersion in a noticeable way, with the audience responding differently when the world feels constructed around the scene rather than existing independently of it. That contrast reveals something important about the original trilogy. It trusted physical texture to do the part of the storytelling and allowed the world to anchor the characters rather than orbit them. The patience created a foundation strong enough to support everything else. Music deserves a brief mention because Howard Shore made a miracle happen here. Instead of writing tracks to simply heighten emotion, he created themes that belong to specific places and identities, so when they return later in the story, they carry memories with them. You don't need me to play the music to understand its effects. Certain melodies instantly bring you back to a location or a moment, and that only works because they were built into the structure of the trilogy from the beginning. The score evolves as the characters evolve, which gives the entire journey a sense of continuity that stretches across all three films. It never feels like the music is trying to tell you how to feel. It supports what's already happening and allows the story to breathe when it needs to. The tone matches the performance and the production, which is why the trilogy feels the way that it does. And even without hearing a single note right now, most people can still recall exactly how it feels. If you really want to understand the standard the trilogy set, you don't have to start with awards or box office numbers. You will look at specific scenes and ask why they still feel powerful after all this time. Take the Balrog confrontation. That moment works because the film doesn't rush towards it. The tension builds gradually, and when the Balrog finally emerges, it feels like something that the story has been moving towards rather than something dropped in for shock value. Helm's Deep operates under the same philosophy. The battle isn't framed as a showcase of dominance. It unfolds as a struggle that feels draining. The audience experiences the effort alongside the defenders, which turns the spectacle into something immersive instead of decorative. Aragorn's charge, for example, as well. That scene could have played as triumphant bravado, yet it becomes an act of resolve. The choice to move forward despite overwhelming odds shifts the focus away from the victory and towards intention, and that is what gives the moment meaning beyond surface excitement. And one final example I want to mention, something as a comparison to today's cinema. Eowyn's confrontation with the Witch King. It carries that same sense of earned payoff. Her story has already established her frustrations and desire to fight, so when she delivers the line, "I am no man," it feels like the natural conclusion of her arc, rather than a statement inserted for emphasis. When you compare that to the all-female sequence in Avengers Endgame, that difference becomes evident. The endgame scene is visually striking, but it feels assembled around symbolism. Characters who rarely share narrative space are brought together for a single image. In Eowyn's case, the groundwork precedes the payoff, which allows the symbolism to exist without announcing itself. The distinction between construction and cultivation is subtle, yet it defines how lasting a moment becomes. The trilogy doesn't chase this impact. Rather, the impact just slowly emerges from the story being told. Spectacle follows the character's developments instead of replacing it, and that order is what gives these scenes their endurance. Looking back at the trilogy now, what stands out isn't just the result itself. We got 3 amazing movies, that's true, but it's how everything aligned around that single goal. The source material was respected, the production moved with patience, and the people involved with it all treated the world as something worth protecting. That approach allowed the story to unfold in its natural pace, which gave every moment more meaning as it settled and resonated with the audience. Modern filmmaking operates a bit differently. As productions move faster, the financial pressures arrive earlier than expected, and creative decisions exist within tighter boundaries. Obviously, the results can still be impressive, yet the underlying philosophy has changed. The Lord of the Rings came from a period where time was treated as part of the craft rather than an obstacle that needed to be worked around. And its impact reaches beyond its own success. Fantasy as a whole carried a different reputation before these films arrived, often seen as a niche or limited in scope. This trilogy expanded what the genre could represent, showing that audiences were willing to invest fully in a world that respected their intention. When I think back to watching it for the first time, what really stays with me wasn't any single visual or a moment of spectacle. It's this sense of underlying belief that carried throughout every frame of the movies. The films trusted its world completely, and that trust transferred to the audiences. The connection hasn't faded, which is why the trilogy continues to hold its place even as filmmaking evolves around it. That standard still exists today, but not as something that's become unreachable to us. Rather, it's something that requires the same alignment, the same patience, and the same willingness to commit fully to the story being told.